I think we'll get started. So welcome back, everyone. I am going to call on my colleague Feng to introduce our keynote speaker. But before I do that, I just wanted to say a few words about this. This is the Hung Lecture and the Albert Hung Lecture Series, which is named in honor of Chinese entrepreneur Albert Hung Chao-hong, who received a doctorate of laws from the University of Victoria in 2005. Dr. Hung is a big believer in education, and we at the center are a beneficiary of that belief in that Dr. Hung gave to us an endowment that enables us to have an annual lecture. And the proviso is that it is to bring somebody, usually to our campus, invite the greater public to attend, to listen to something of current public interest regarding the Asia-Pacific region. And when we knew that we were going to do this conference, I earmarked this lecture to enable us to bring a special guest to the conference to be our keynote. So on that note, Feng, I invite you to do the introductions.
Thank you, Helen. My name is Feng Xu, and I'm Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Victoria. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Xiang Biao, our keynote speaker for the CAPI Hung Lecture Series. It's a pleasure because of Dr. Xiang Biao's achievements in themselves. This is also a pleasure on the personal level because Dr. Xiang's work, in particular, his work on migration infrastructure, implying migration is highly mediated, influenced my own work on migration in China. So Dr. Xiang Biao is a professor of social anthropology at Oxford University and director of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Germany. His research addresses various types of migration, internal and international, unskilled and highly skilled, emigration and return migration, and the places and people left behind in China, India, and other parts of Asia. Through the lens of migration, he has examined a wide range of political economy issues, including state-society relations, labor, social reproduction, and mobility governance. In his recent research, he asks why commercial recruitment intermediaries have become so prominent in unskilled labor migration in East Asia, a finding that contradicts the assumption that modern institutions and technologies have a disembedding and disintermediating effect on labor markets. Currently, Dr. Xiang Biao is re-examining the multifaceted implications of mobility and immobility for societies and individuals, as evidenced during the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition, he's studying a variety of social debates in China, social research practices in the Global South, and the new patterns of economic circulation. Dr. Xiang Biao studied sociology at the prestigious Beijing University in China and received his PhD in social anthropology from the University of Oxford. He worked at Oxford from 2004. He's the winner of the 2008 Anthony Leeds Prize for his book, Global Body Shopping, and the 2012 William L. Holland Prize for the article, Predatory Practices. His 2000 Chinese book, 跨越边界的社区, published in English as Transcending Boundaries in 2005, was reprinted in 2018 as a contemporary classic. His work has been translated into Japanese, French, Korean, Spanish, and Italian. So please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Xiang Biao by either indicating, hand clapping sign on the Zoom. This is really a very strange medium. Over to you, Xiang Biao.
Thank you so much, Feng, for the very kind and detailed introduction. And thanks, Helen and Katie, for the invitation and also for setting up the link. I mean, of course, I'm very honored and also, frankly, I'm rather nervous as well to give this so-called keynote. I mean, I'm not sure it's a key or not, but I would like to use this opportunity to share with you something I have been thinking about recently. And in particular, I wish to raise 3 questions for all of us to think together at this workshop. The first question is about precarity, a key concept in our conference. I'm now just wondering how, first of all, should we go beyond this concept and how? Of course, there's this concept is a contested concept, and many people say actually, I mean, precarity became a concern primarily in the global north. It is a global north perspective, and with global north perspective, that the precarity has its own traction, right? Because what the precarity means is basically the end of Fordism and this stable unionized labor relations is being replaced by temporary gig economy and etc. But in the global south, it is always the case. So precarity certainly exists, but I mean, we're not denying the empirical relevance of this phenomenon. But as an analytical category, it doesn't really capture what's going on in many parts of the world. And also, even empirically, I also have some question about this. We're talking about like refugees, illegal migrants, and human trafficking in the last panel. I mean, as we see in Europe, the refugees are lives in danger, at least lives in distress. I mean, they are not, if we use the word precarity to describe refugees or human trafficking, probably it's not that accurate. And also in my own field of work with temporary labor migrants, whom would normally be described as precarious labor in the English literature, I rarely come across anybody, the migrants themselves, who are worried about the precarity. What they're worried about is sense of pressure. They keep telling me how pressurized they feel. They have to look after the family, and the medical care is so expensive, therefore they have to work very hard, both in China and overseas. I will detail this a little later. And also recently, I'm working with colleagues on the case of like delivery workers, like Amazon. And in China, of course, there's no Amazon, but we have other platforms, as well as the taxi drivers. And I mean, the topic that comes up again and again is the sense of pressure. So, during like lunchtime, the amount of order is so high, so they have to rush really breathlessly in order to complete all the orders, because otherwise, their score will be deducted, which will lead to the reduction of their pay. Of course, it's this. Certainly, we can describe the work as precarious in the sense it's not stable at all. But from their subjective feeling, the question is not the lack of security. This is not the main concern. The main concern actually is something deeper: the sense of oppression, and there's no choice but to do that. Actually, there is a job, at least in Asia. The employment problem is not the main issue. The issue is this type of work is being performed. So that is the first question, whether or not we should go beyond the precarity. And then I'm thinking whether or not we can use terms such as very simple oppression as a possible term, because this is their subjective experiences. And then we need, of course, to theorize it. And there's my question about the precarity also is related to a consideration about the research strategy. It seems to me that the discussion about the precarity is somehow being trapped by an emphasis on empirical observation and about the people's experiences. Even though I think it's probably not very accurate in capturing people's experiences, but somehow we say, okay, you know, the concept of precarity works because you can say people's experience appear to be very precarious. And this is probably indicative a general trend in English literature and thinking now, namely that you foreground a particular aspect of experience and then hoping to develop certain strategies like creating commons based on that experience. Okay, so we are all precarious, we're all facing precarious working life, so whether or not we can form solidarity. I'm just wondering whether or not it will work. Would it work to have broad-based solidarity and a social movement just based on shared experiences? Shared experiences are certainly important, but I think certain analysis of the position, more structural, more systemic analysis of the position of that experience in the larger social system probably is necessary for forming bigger strategies for social mobilization. So therefore, my second question is related to the question of creating commons. I mean, how shall we move from here to, you know, the utopian future that we will have a commons? Is a question of systemic analysis. I don't know whether you agree or not. I feel, at least in anthropology, this is really lacking. This is really lacking. We have this mixture of very quite abstract philosophical and theoretical thinking, or sometimes just simply language on one hand, and then fragmented experiences. You know, we mix them too, and then and of course, that is very provocative in terms of inciting certain humanitarian concerns, but I'm not sure how far it can get us at a structural analysis to tell us, okay, how these phenomena are related to other phenomena, you know, how the society, the world as a entirety work together, rather than we just see some people are suffering, so we feel empathy. So therefore, the second question is the necessity of systemic analysis and why it is lacking. I mean, I don't know whether or not in political science or in sociology, maybe colleagues are doing much better than anthropologists. So the third question is related to the notion of social reproduction. I'm wondering whether social reproduction may help us in achieving this, to introduce systemic analysis and to go beyond just experiential description like precarity. So why what is social reproduction? Basically, social reproduction means the production of people. So, so therefore it is the producing, maintenance, and enhancing life, both on daily basis as well as cross-generationally, right? So giving birth is certainly part of social reproduction, but education, care for children, for sick, for the elderly, family formation, marriage, and all that is the domain of social reproduction. And why I'm thinking of social reproduction, I think, I look at the program that I know that we have some very interesting presentations lined up for tomorrow. or later today. Yeah. So as we can see, many cases of migration, especially in Asia, are related to social reproduction in one way or another. I think probably it's safe to say that the two cases of transnational migration that have been most studied in Asia over the last 15 or 10 years are number one, domestic helpers, and number two, students, educational migrants. I mean, those domestic helpers can be conceptualized as a labor migration, but they are performing a very particular type of labor. They go overseas to maintain and sustain life in the destination countries. And the student migration is that they migrate in order to enhance their life. They are not migrating to participate in productive material production process. Right? It's about social reproduction. And as we know that the migration for industrial jobs, for like a plantation economy have been declining. In Asia, that is quite clear, and the migration related to social reproduction has been increasing. So that is the number one, it's an empirical observation. And the number two, the reason I'm thinking of using such a broad category of social reproduction to encompass very diverse phenomenon, ranging from student migration to retirement migration to investment migration. As you know, lots of investor migrants coming to Canada, especially from China. Of course, the scheme now stopped, but they hardly make any productive investment. I mean, what does it do? Is basically buy properties, and then why do they come to Canada? Because there's a better air, better water, the greenery, educational opportunities for children. It's all about life itself, right? So put all these such diverse cases together under the rubric of social reproduction. Why? I mean, is this productive or appropriate? I don't know. But the reason I try to do that is precisely to think whether or not it is possible to develop some systemic analysis. I mean, the power of systemic analysis is precisely to go beyond the obvious, taken for granted demarcation between cases and see whether or not there's a connection behind this, right? Whether or not a connection between student migration and investor migration and the migration of care workers. So that is the second reason, and the second reason, we can go further to discuss the origin of the notion of social reproduction and why for what reason we social scientists have been talking about this notion at all. So that's, I think it's I hope it will still have some value for us to inherit from the earlier discussion from Marx and Engels more than 100 years ago, and the 1960s feminist debates about the social reproduction, which is quite different from what we witness today. I mean, we can discuss that later. But I'm particularly influenced by the French Marxist anthropology tradition, particularly in the school, so-called the articulation model school, right? They try to make a link between imperialism with social reproduction. The main idea is that capitalism in the core countries can sustain the self because of social reproductions in the peripheries. Why? Social reproduction in the peripheries based on kinship, based on pre-capitalist mode of organization of economic activities, they produce life in a way that all this labor power, these lives, embody surplus values of other people, especially women. And then when they migrate to the core, actually they are bringing them the collective value of the community into the industry. I mean, of course, we cannot apply this model directly now today. But the idea is that the production of life itself is somehow, I mean, in the articulation model, the production of life is separate from the production of goods, material, yet is critical for the production of goods and the accumulation of capital. Is, for me, is quite inspiring. So I'm just thinking whether or not we can bring this idea back, thinking of how life itself is produced. So, I mean, the production of life itself is quite a systemic arrangement because of the social institutions and also cultural norms, etc. So it's not anything random. So, and what we call as a precarity or life in distress probably can be incorporated into this the consideration about how the production life itself is arranged, right? So the precarity probably shows a particular mode of life production. So it is not simply, precarity is a question of industrial relations, whether or not you have a secured job or whether or not you have the insurance, etc. But it should be understood on the broader terms. So that is my three main questions. And today I probably just use the remaining time, give you one small case, actually, which is not, it is about labor migration from China. And this labor whom I worked with, these labor migrants, they are not directly engaged with reproductive labor. They are not moving overseas as nurses or care workers. They are going to Singapore, South Korea, and Japan, mainly as unskilled manual workers. So therefore, they are very traditional, the older style labor migrants. But what intrigued me is that why do they want to leave China, where living standards and the wages have been increasing quite significantly, while their overseas incomes have been stagnant over the last 20 years or so. Furthermore, the migrants pay very high intermediary fees in order to go overseas to work for normally is 2 or 3 years contract, and the first at least half a year's salary will be just enough to pay the agent fee. So why do they do that? So my explanation is that is related to the question of social reproduction. They are migrating not because they are driven by the lack of employment opportunities. Of course, I mean, employment opportunity in China is more. They have more to offer than in Japan. And they are not driven by sheer poverty, but they are driven by the pressure of meeting their social reproduction duties, such as getting married, send the children to the good schools, and buying properties, and paying medical care costs for families. And why do they have to go overseas to meet these duties? And that is because the very important is about time pressure. In China, that you can get jobs that is relatively high salary, but it is not very secured in terms of how many months you can work. If you work as unskilled, like construction workers a year, probably only 6 months you have the work to do. But in overseas, because you're migrants, as one agent told me, recruitment agent told me, the main attraction for Chinese workers go to Japan is because in Japan, the employer will make sure that you are not sitting there idle. They will make sure you will be working all the time. And of course, including after hours, which the pay will be higher. And the workers like that. Another reason given by workers to explain why they are keen to go to work overseas is because the lack of social life overseas. So in China, you have social, you have friends gathering, you have all these banquets and etc. So the money can go away very quickly. But overseas, you are isolated, you are encapsulated. And this is very much Asian model. As well as in Africa, if you join the Chinese development project in Africa, so workers are put up in camps, hardly any contact with the local society, so therefore there's no expenditure overseas. So therefore, the saving, the speed of saving is faster than in China. Why speed of saving is so important? Because all these reproductive duties are time sensitive. You cannot delay when your children go to school, and you cannot, of course, delay about medical care. So if you look at their work experiences overseas, I mean, there's no, any precarity. Is a very secure. I mean, secure in the sense that you work at least 10 hours a day, and also that you will get a salary at the end, because the regulatory regime about foreign workers in Asian countries are relatively quite strictly implemented. So, I mean, there's rights abuse, etc. But of course, but they do not end up in a general condition of precarity. So the point is that they are pushed by the pressure to meet the reproductive expectations about their reproductive duties. And what are these main duties? As I said, number one is a marriage. And related to here, don't go to the data, the cost of marriage actually has been increasing quite significantly and steadily in the countryside in China. And related to a marriage is the housing cost. Housing cost, this is a relatively new phenomenon in China, but it's about 10 years old now. Is that for a country man to marry a country woman, you need a property in the city. If you just have a house in your village, it's not good enough. Right? You need a property in the city. So of course, it's, the cost is very high. And there's a complex political economy reason behind this. Why such a property in city become a necessity for marriage? I mean, you can say there's a cultural reason, etc. But the whole property market boom is very closely related to how the Chinese local government is financed. So the local government have very strong incentive to keep the real estate sector to grow and keep the price high. So thirdly, education. I mean, again, it's a complex stories why the cost of education goes up all the time. But the one just small observation that I had in rural China is that preschool children in the countryside nowadays go to kindergartens, which was a surprise to me. In the countryside, normally, if you are below 5, you are just children. you play around with other children, and the parents have no time for you. And once you reach to the age of 5, 6, you just become a kind of labor to help parents to run household chore and etc. But no longer. There's a huge change. The preschool children, 3, 4, 5, you go to kindergarten. But in countryside, there is no public kindergartens, hardly any. So they're all private, very expensive. So finally, it's about medical care costs have been going up steadily. Again, the reason is complex. The government has put lots of money to medical care, but there is, I think, it's a typical example of regulatory capturing. The investment from the government fund basically became a source of profit for drug companies and hospitals. So in the end, the government investment in welfare basically just increased patients' paying capacity and then increased the profit of the hospital. A result of this is, for example, hospital will import or buy very sophisticated equipments and then over-prescribe medicines and expensive examinations to patients who actually do not need such complicated examination, and then they make money from this, right? And the hospital could buy all these expensive equipments partly because of government support. So all this is the reproduction activities become monetized. It's not necessarily become a commodity, but certainly it requires cash payment, and that is create a tremendous pressure for poor household, and especially for those in the countryside. Why? Because people in the countryside can be asset rich. They have land, they have herds, they have cattle, and they have harvests, but they are cash poor. Now, this current arrangement about the social reproduction is heavily mediated through cash. So the peasants told me, as a peasants, we don't see money until the end of the year, and we still don't see much cash at the end of the year. But nowadays, the cash is going out every single day, because whatever you want to do, you need the cash for education, for medical care, and etc. So that the lack of cash is also a direct driving force for out-migration. And then why does this matter? It matters in the sense that if in older days, people migrate because of there's no job at home and they want to work overseas or outside, their migration is primarily a response to the employment opportunities in the destination countries. And so you can say that the migration pattern somehow is more rational. But what I observed on the ground is that this type of migration that is driven by social reproduction pressure, it often becomes kind of less rational, because they are not go overseas for a good job that they desire to do, but they are going overseas because they need the money urgently to meet a certain social reproduction duties. So therefore, they are willing to invest a lot as long as the agent can send them out quickly. So the demand for speed is very high. They say, okay, we pay you up to $8,000 US, not only for job opportunities, but for a job opportunities quickly. Within 3 months, send me out. Then I can start, pay back the agent fee and start saving. Of course, and this also make them, the migrants, even more individualistic, and they don't regard themselves as a labor, and they're thinking themselves sometimes as an entrepreneur, and thinking of the money as investment, and then they can go overseas to earn money quickly, then can buy a property back in China before the price become too high. So the calculation is like that. And then, of course, the intermediaries became even more powerful in this type of migration. And yeah, so like I hardly see anything like a migration culture, for example, a community, collectively everyone wanted to go overseas. I mean, that's kind of pattern. The choice is still there. Of course, there are some places people are more aware about overseas opportunities than other places, but the migration became very individualized. Is often okay because every individual's needs for about the reproduction duties are different. So once you have a need, you want to migrate, right? It's not like a collective base of labor supply. So that's probably my final point to end this presentation is another question more specific about the notion of social reproduction. In the 1970s, the French model of articulation model, people say, okay, social reproduction is carried out in the periphery in a so-called traditional king-based pre-capitalist mode. So therefore, the cost is not calculated in monetary terms, and then you have the free labor inputs by the mothers, sisters, and the wives, right? So therefore, you produce a cheap labor that can be used in the core after migration. But now somehow the picture is turned upside down. Social reproduction in the sending country, at least in my current case, China, is become deeply monetized. And then it is the monetization of reproduction itself becoming a pushing force for outer migration. And on the other hand, we know globally, their labor puts actually is no longer a critical component in the global economy. So that is very different from the post-Second World War phenomenon, when migrant industrial labor was very important for the post-war reconstruction in Europe, for instance. So therefore, that was critical for sustaining the global economy system at that time. But I don't see that is the case now, because most of employers who hire foreign industrial workers are very small, especially in Japan, are normally kind of family business in remote areas. They hire migrant workers, of course, they exploit them, but not for any profit, super profit, but mainly for survival. And the government import foreign workers to a great extent, actually, just to keep these small enterprises alive and keep them floating. So it is not a strategic. So their contribution to the global economy is no longer strategic, but the pushing force, the social reproduction side actually became more important. Okay, sorry, yeah, then there's the idea of how reproduction is related to migration can be more clearly illustrated in other cases, such as students and investor migrants. But here I'm just look at even for the migrants who are not performing reproductive labor, they're still driven by social reproduction. The final point, a clarification. Social reproduction probably give us a sense of repetition, right? They keep something going, repeating itself. I think that is something very interesting to think about. Actually, in my view, social reproduction is a domain where social transformation takes place. I mean, especially if you look at Asia and China. The Chinese parents curse word. When the Chinese parents get very angry with the children, what they say is that if you don't study hard enough, you will just become like your parents, which is the worst thing will happen to the children. So the whole investment in education and social reproduction actually is to seek upward mobility. And again, this is very hard to be captured by the notion of precarity. This ordinary people's calculation there. So the social reproduction is not mean repetition, but rather it can be a place for transformation. New meaning is being created. Of course, we know that this is a very important driving force for the household and the family to make all these important decisions, including savings and how to spend money and etc. I'm saying this is to make a plea to think whether or not we should take social reproduction really as a more important and strategic site to observe the current social changes, rather than social reproduction is just as a supplementary process through which the dominant structure repeated itself. Yeah. So I will stop here, but as you can tell, it is really a work in progress and thinking along the way. So I would very appreciate your comments about the systemic analysis, the notion of social reproduction, question about precarity. Thank you.